There's somebody trying to get over the bottle. Can they get in the bottle?
Yeah, it's unlocked, but I think we should go. Yeah, every time we have something here, it's like.
I think it's for the sisters.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, Elaine. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Hey, Danny, how you doing? Good to see you. Yeah, Friday works for coming, Jack. Oh, no, we haven't started yet, so you're fine.
Well, we'll let people keep trickling in, but we're gonna get started here.
Okay.
My name is Ellen. I'm the office manager at the 1882 Foundation. We're an organization that's dedicated to preserving and uplifting Chinese American stories, such as Richard, who's come today to talk about his book, Tangled Roots, and his family history and how it's deeply connected to Washington, D.C.'s Chinese American community. So thank you, Richard, for coming by.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for coming. Good afternoon, everybody. And as Ellen said, my name is Richard Chanding, and I was the author of Tangled Roots, Two Family Stories, One American Heritage. And I thought I'd start by giving you kind of a backstory about how this talk came about. And I came upon this DC planning report. I don't know if you all have seen it. If you haven't seen it, it's a very good report. It has a lot of information in it. And as a matter of fact, my wife sent it to me and she said, you know, have you seen it? I think your grandparents are mentioned. And so sure enough, I looked at the report and they were included in it. And I wanted to give a little bit of clarifications. So I emailed Ellen, and because they pretty much authored the report. And there was a little bit of back and forth, and Ted Bong, the director, asked me if I did this talk. So I said, yes, I'd be happy to. So I feel like I'm a Washingtonian. I've spent over half my life in Washington. The first 40 years of my life were spent in Washington or around Washington. So I do feel like I'm a Washingtonian. This is where I've spent some of my time. I was born in Washington, but I grew up in Tacoma Park in Maryland suburbs. When I was going to architecture school at the University of Maryland, moved down to Adams, Oregon, spent 14 years there. That's where I married. We had our first house. We had our first child. And also worked in Adams, Oregon at an architecture firm down there. But I also had Chinese American ancestors that lived in Washington in this small section of historic downtown Washington. And that's the area that we're going to talk about in a lot of detail. And it's the area around Pennsylvania Avenue, between the Capitol and the White House. And not coincidentally, we're sitting in that area right now. So it's this area where my ancestors spent a lot of time that we're going to talk about. And as the title of the book infers, I'm from a mixed heritage. I do have a Chinese father and a mother that has European ancestry. So their roots were very different. These are the people we're going to be talking about. We're going to focus on my father's side of the family, being at the 1882 Foundation. And on the left there is my grandfather, Charlie Bing, in the middle, Mamie Bing, and on the right, my father, Robert Bing. So the two sides of my family's stories were very, very different. Their immigration story. On the left, you can see my father's family when my father was about 5 years old. On the right is my mother's family. My grandfather is about the same age, 5 years old. In the middle with my great-grandmother and four of his sisters. But they grew up in Appalachian Virginia, in the southwestern Virginia. So their stories were very, very different. That always kind of fascinated me. Not only did they come from different parts of the world, they came at different times, but they were also received differently when they came to the United States. And they were treated differently. So we're going to talk again about my father's side primarily, but just to give you a quick background on my mother's side, like I said, her ancestors are all from Europe, and if you go back far enough, just about all of her lines, family lines, are from like the early 1700s, and they're from Europe before, of course, this was a country. And they primarily came to the Philadelphia area, settled in the backcountry of Pennsylvania, and then her direct descendants moved down to Southwest Virginia. Again, that's where she grew up, and that's a picture of her with her mother. And then when she became a young adult, 1942, right when the World War II was starting, she was 19 years old, and she decided to move to Washington, D.C. to start her life there. And I think she always loved Washington. She always spoke fondly of it, so she really felt at home in Washington. And then when she was 74, she moved back downtown, back down to Woodville, where she was from to live out her life. And then 2019, she passed away at age 95. And of course, she left a lot of things behind, as you do when you pass away. There were boxes filled with photos and documents and, all kinds of things. But I found this note that she had written herself that she evidently found in a magazine or a book. And it resonated with her evidently. And this is the actual note that she wrote. And it says, "To forget one's ancestors, be a brook without a source, a tree without a root." So I think that resonated with her, is partly the inspiration for the book. And I included, of course, her side of this family in the stories. We're not going to talk about it in detail, but these are some of the stories that are included from her side of the family. So in all the stories that I've tried to tell in the book, I thought truth was of utmost importance. And I think in general, that's how history, whether it be family history, country's history, or world history, that's how it always should be told. Even if the truths and the facts are uncomfortable at times. So to move on to my father's side of the family, I'm going to start with my grandfather, Charlie Bing. And his Chinese name was Chan Zong Bing, also known as Chin Bing. And you can see that he changed his name from Chan Zong Bing to Charlie Bing. He took his given name, Bing, as surname. And of course, in China, the family name is first. So my family name really is Chan. And, or Chen, because Chen, and Chen in China are all the same surname. And it's a very common surname in China. And it's the most common in Guangdong province where he's from. But I didn't know him personally. He died well before I was born. And, but we did have stories from him, and I did some research from him on the internet. There's a lot of newspaper articles I was able to research on him. And he had a limited zupu that he left my father. And I don't know if you know what a zupu is. It's a genealogical book. And some of them are very extensive. This one isn't very extensive. It goes back a couple generations. And it includes, of course, where he was from in China, and there's some details about where the family raised on, things like that. So I'm going to outline his life for you in milestones, and we're going to talk about all these milestones in more detail. He was born in China in 1865. When he was 14 years old, 1879, he immigrated to San Francisco. And then spent some time in Boston. We're not sure exactly how he got to Boston or how much time he spent in Boston, but he shows up in Washington around 1891 when he was 26 years old. And then he spent about 41 years in Washington before going back to China. And then he died in China at the age of 69 in 1934. So he was from a little village called Chongling Village. It's a small agrarian community in southeastern China. It's in Guangdong Province, in the Taishan area, in the Pearl River Delta. And he likely started out from a river port called the Taishan Haiku Port. It's a confluence of two rivers. There's a port there, and they would bring travelers, to the South China Sea. They would then connect to ports in Guangzhou, Macau, and Hong Kong to then, take their transoceanic journey to different countries. He was a third child of four, with his sister being the oldest. And this is a view of a fairly contemporary view of Chongling Village on the right. My sister, Paula, actually went there in 1986. That's a picture of her in front of the gate on the left there, black pants. And while there, she was able to connect to some villagers that knew of our family. And because of that connection, we were able to contact some cousins that we didn't know previously. And we're still in contact with them now. So just generally about the migration, some of you may know this. Migration began in earnest in the 1850s after civil unrest in China. And the Taishan area, again, some of you probably already know this, the Taishan area plays a large outsized role in the immigration story to America, so much so that said that 86% of the Chinese Americans trace their roots to the Taishan area. And there's plaques and markers in that port, the Taishan Haiku port, that commemorate this migration. So when he came to San Francisco in 1879, it was a bustling port, had a diverse community, but it also had a fairly significant Chinese community. And we were told that he did railroad work. My mother-in-law would say he was in the transcontinental railroad work, which we know couldn't have been possible since it was completed in 1869, a decade before he came. But, he could have been involved in other railroad work. For instance, there was a line that began in San Francisco, ended up in Deming, New Mexico, part of what they call the second transcontinental railroad. And when it finished in Deming, New Mexico, it was 1881, it would have been 16. And the railroad workers from China at the time were anywhere from 15 to 25, so that could have been possible. But he could have been involved in other railroad work or possibly even mining work, but he did come as a laborer. And he came at a time of anti-Asian sentiment. And some of you probably know, about some of these things. Excuse me. But it was really a grassroots sentiment. It came from the work camps, the towns and the cities, and eventually it worked its way into federal legislation. And the first federal legislation was the Page Act of 1875. And that tried to exclude indentured servants or servants that came under forced labor, but also had a vague prohibition of women that came as prostitutes, particularly Chinese women that came as prostitutes. So that vague language on prostitution was used to restrict, a lot of Chinese women from coming in, and it drastically reduced the number of Chinese women that came in after that act. And of course, that affected the development of Chinese families in America because of that. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act, you all must know something about that because you hear of the 1882 foundation. But it was, a ban. It banned Chinese laborers and only excluded professionals like merchants, teachers, students, and diplomats. So it also acted to, severely restrict the Chinese from coming in. But it also prohibited Chinese residents that were already here from becoming naturalized citizens. And it required that if they wanted to leave, they had to get reentry certificates to prove that they were here legally in the first place. And then the Gary Act of 1892 extended the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it also mandated that all the Chinese in the country carried papers with them, basically, proving that they were here illegally. So they had to have papers. They didn't produce them when they're asked for their papers. They were at risk of being deported. And then the Scott Act of 1888, remember all those reentry certificates that were required? Well, the Scott Act of 1888 said they were nullified. Even if you had the reentry certificate, you couldn't come back in the country. So that essentially banned coming back in with those reentry certificates, stranding about 20 to 30,000 Chinese from coming back in the country. And then the Johnson-Reed Act severely limited immigration, but completely excluded Asian immigration. So it was a time, again, of anti-Asian sentiment that he came. And I did want to expand the time that he was in Washington with some milestones. And again, we're going to talk about them in more detail. But he arrived in Washington around 1891. He was in the laundry business at the time. And then he entered the restaurant business around 1905 at the Hong Kong Low Restaurant. He married my grandmother around 1906. And then they had their first child, Mary, in 1907. In 1910, my father was born, and Mary passed away at a very young age. And he had another restaurant, the Asia Cafe, in 1918. And then he left again to go back to China in 1932. So, again, the first evidence I could find of him being in Washington was this wanted ad, which I think is likely from him. And it says, wanted Chin Bing, 3003 M Street, Northwest. Call and see me, the only married Chinaman in the laundry business in Washington, first class work. I want to point out that this reference to being married wouldn't have been to my grandmother. We didn't meet for 15 years, but he did make reference in other articles in 1895 of having a white wife in Boston. So it may have been reference to that. And I also want to point out below that ad, there's a excerpt from the Boyd's Business Directory of Washington of 1890 that says there was a laundry at that location, 3003 M Street, that was called Sam Lee. And that's important. I'll talk more about Sam Lee in the next few slides. But I think that was his first link to Sam Lee. So I'm going to start filling out the map, and you can see the original Chinatown was on Pennsylvania Avenue between around 3rd and 5th Street. And then the Sam Lee Laundry that we're talking about, or the one that my grandfather advertised for, let's say, is in Georgetown, so it's way west, not in Chinatown at all. So Sam Lee in 1895 was actually a faction of laundrymen. And according to newspaper articles that I read at the time, 1895, it was comprised of about 17 laundrymen in Washington. And that was a minority, so that wasn't the majority of the businesses. There's a minority faction, say, in Chinatown. And my grandfather was said to be, in articles, a principal member of the Sam Lee Company. So the Sam Lee headquarters at the time was at 4.5 in Missouri Avenue, right on the edge of the original Chinatown. And in my research for my grandfather, I discovered that it was alleged that he was involved in crimes in Chinatown at the time. So I'm going to talk about him. I can't ignore him. There were so many articles about it. But it's one of those uncomfortable truths. And, there were hints about that when we were growing up, but I think it was more about what wasn't said than what was said, that we knew there was something to be uncovered. And in my research, I think I uncovered some of that. So I did want to put it into context first because it was sensationalized. Chinatown at the time, all written by the white press, was an exotic place back in the 1890s. And any kind of conflicts or crime in Chinatown was, I think, sensationalized. And it was great fodder for the press. And I'm not saying that they had untruths in their articles, but there was an element of, I think, exaggeration, sensationalization. But the fact of the matter is, it was a small percentage of the Chinese community that was involved in these alleged crimes, and it actually hurt the ones that weren't involved in it. They were peace-loving, which is the majority of the Chinese residents at the time. They were peace-loving and hard-working people. But again, I couldn't ignore it. 1895, the summer of 1895 in particular, was a prolific time for these articles. And this is some of them. One article that was reported on a lot was about Ah Sing, who was with the Sam Lee Company, being shot in the leg in an assassination attempt by a rival group, the Hop Trombone Company. More chew with that. But he lived, and they couldn't indict Moy Chu of the Hop Trombone Company because there wasn't enough evidence. But again, that's just one of the incidents that's what was reported at the time. And the ostensible reason for some of the fighting was that Sam Lee Company was charging lower rates than what they called the Union Company. And that represented again the majority of the businessmen in Chinatown. And the Hop Chung Long Company is called out as the Union Company, but also in articles, Huang Song Lang, Huang Sang Lung was also called out as part of who the Stanley Company were fighting with. So I tried to zoom out a bit and see if there was any key influences. And I realized that this may be oversimplifying things a bit, but I think there were a couple key influences. One from the Qigong Tong, and then the other from Hip Sing Tong. And the Qigong Tong represented, I think, the majority of the businesses. I think Hop Chung Long and Huang Sang Long, they were all under the Qigong Tong influence, or part of them. They were also known as Hongmen or Chinese Freemasons. And I mean, they had traditional beliefs, but they also had political aspirations. They wanted the overthrow of the Qing dynasty in favor of Sun Yat-sen's republic at the time. But they also had a hand in gambling and regulation of laundries, so setting prices for laundries. And on the other side, I believe the Sam Lee Company is starting to get influenced by the Hip Sing Tong, primarily from New York, and I'll talk more about that. And in these articles where they were in court, alleged of crimes, and they were accused of being Hip Sing Tong members, the Sam Lee members, they would always deny it, but I think, as you'll see, the influence from the Hip Sing Tong in New York is undeniable, really. But they had a more pragmatic and business approach to things, but they were known for extortion, blackmail, and demanding protection money. So they were alleged to be highbinders, and highbinders, if you haven't heard that name, is kind of a Chinese gang member, a criminal gang member. And this is an excerpt from an article basically saying that. And I've highlighted three names. One, my grandfather, Charlie Bing, another Ah Sing, and another Charlie Tong Sing, or Chinese name is Mong Ki Sing. And I've pulled out these three because I want to talk about them in a couple slides in another kind of relationship. So again, Charlie Bing, my grandfather, was named in these articles, and in the articles it said that he's also known as Chin Bing, but they also said some of the articles he's known as Xing Bing or Qing Bin or Qing Bing. I think it's just the way they heard what was being pronounced. And then Charlie Tong Sing was also known as Scarface Charlie. And this Chinese name for Lemon Tong Sing or Long Ki Sing. And then there was Ah Sing, also known as Moya Sing. And again, I'm going to talk about these three in particular. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Charlie Tong Sing's history, because he has a pretty interesting history. He was involved in two Arctic adventures before he came to Washington. One was the Jeannette expedition, which was from 1879 to 1881. And it was an ill-fated mission to try to find the Northwest Passage. But if you want to read a good book about it, Anthony Sykes wrote a really interesting true adventure book about it called In the Kingdom of Ice. But he was one of 13 survivors out of the original crew of 33. And a really fascinating story. he got a Congressional Medal of Honor, the first Chinese American to get a Congressional Medal of Honor for being a survivor in that expedition. But he's also involved in the expedition to rescue the Lady Franklin expedition, what's also known as the Greeley expedition in 1884. So he was on those two expeditions. He got a U.S. Navy medal for the Greeley expedition. So an interesting, Arctic adventure history. But he's also known to be a notorious criminal in New York. This is a quote from Louis Beck's 1898 book on New York's Chinatown that says Charlie Tong Sing is the head man of the Hip Sing Tong in New York. And this is before Sai Wing Mok or Mok Duck, who was the infamous head of Hip Sing Tong right around the turn of the century. So I admittedly went down a bit of a rabbit hole, and I'll explain that to you. Looking at the names Ah Sing, Charlie Tong Sing, and then my grandfather. But this is the crew manifest from the Jeannette expedition. And you can see there's 3 Chinese men, young men, on that expedition: Charlie Tong Sing, Ah Sam, and Ah Sing. And Ah Sam, we talked about Charlie Tong Sing, but Ah Sam perished on the expedition. He didn't survive. But there was also someone named Ah Sing. And it made me think, could that be the same Ah Sing that was in Washington with Charlie Tong Sing and the Sam Lee Company? I don't know definitively whether it was or not, but it's an interesting question. Ah Sing was actually didn't complete the journey. He 2 months after he left in July of 1879 from San Francisco. 2 months later, he was sent back to San Francisco because of poor performance aboard a resupply ship. So he again left San Francisco in July, came back around maybe September in 1879. So they're all known to be, around the port of San Francisco in 1879, the year my grandfather came. Just a little rabbit hole I went down. Could they have known each other back then? Was Ah Sing the same one that knew Charlie Tong Sing back then? We know from the articles that Charlie Tong Sing stayed with Ah Sing when he was in Washington. So they were very close. And Charlie Tong Sing would come and interpret for Ah Sing in court cases in Washington. So they were very close. Just interesting question. So I think around 1895, the Hip Sing Tong members from New York began to influence the Sam Lee Company. And this is an excerpt from the DC planning report that was written by the 1882 Foundation that basically said that Ah Sing was threatened by members of the Qigong Tong, and he called for help. He called New York and said, could you give me some help? I'm being threatened. So around 1895, New York Hip Sing Tong members start to come. And I'm going to highlight 3 names. Charlie Tong Sing, we talked about, Wong Get, and Wary S. Charles. And that was taken from an article in 1895 in the Morning Times in Washington. Those 3 names. So I think there was some influence by other cities in Washington, New York being a prominent one, influencing Washington. But this is an excerpt from an article in 1895 from the Washington Times. It says, he said, wearing a, I really think they mean wearing S. Charles, is a prominent New York Chinaman and a friend of Chin Bing's, from my grandfather's. And just a long story short on Wary S. Charles, he was very prominent in New York in the 1890s, and as a member of the Hip Sing Tong there. He ran into threats from the Leong Tong, and ended up going to Boston and starting the Hip Sing Tong in Boston. And he became president of the Hip Sing Tong there. He was with a shootout with the Leong Tong, and he and others were arrested, indicted, convicted of murder. He was sent to prison, and he ended up dying in prison in 1915, natural causes. And then there's Wong Get, and Wong Get, in both Wary S. Charles and Wong Get, in newspaper articles, Washington newspaper articles, would say that they would come down and assist with the trials against the Sand Lake Company members and would translate for them in court. But Wong Get was even more prominent in New York's Hip Sing Tong. He was known as their advisor, very involved in conflicts when the Hip Sing Tong around the turn of the century were fighting it out with the Leong Tong in New York. But this is an article, this is an excerpt from the book Tong Wars by Scott Seligman. And he's referencing a Washington Post article that says in 1895, Wong Get traveled to Washington, D.C. from New York to organize the Hip Sing chapter. And then Charlie Tong Sing we talked about already. This is simply an article referencing all those things that I already told you. And Charlie Bing and my grandfather was called out as one of the band of these desperate, they call them desperate highbinders in this article. So that was, 1895, and by the time the 1900s came around, his life seemed to settle down a little bit more, and outwardly, the press was talking about him more favorably. It was said that he was one of the leaders of the Chinese colony in Washington, one of the most intelligent of the Chinese colony. Excuse me. And it was obvious that they would come to him when they wanted to find out things about China or Chinatown. Like there was an article about Chinese New Year's Eve, the Lunar New Year. They would come to him for quotes about, what he was doing for that, how they prepared for that, and so on. And he also, of course, had his restaurant business, and so he was a successful businessman. And he married and began a family with my grandmother. So he was also the founding officer of the Empire Reform Association in Washington. And if you don't know what that is, it was a worldwide organization that wanted Guangzhou Emperor back in power after the power was taken from him by the Empress Dowager Cixi. So, and Guangzhou Emperor was more reform-minded. That's why they wanted him back in power. They wanted progressive reforms that he advocated. But he was basically in house arrest. He died. This is a quote of my grandfather. They came to him and interviewed him. What do you think about this? It was when Guangzhou Emperor had died in 1908. And it was reported that there was an impending death of the Empress Dowager Cixi. And interestingly, it was found that Guangzhou Emperor, he was only 37 years old. He died of acute arsenic poisoning. They actually exhumed his body in the 2012 and did testing on it. So it was, they think it was murder. Of course, and after 1912, the Empire Reform Association became obsolete because of the Qing dynasty collapsing in favor of the Republic of China. And he also became an advocate for Chinese Americans in Washington. This is what we were told as kids, that he would interpret for the Chinese that were new arrivals that didn't know how to deal with the government systems or needed interpreting in the court. This is also an example of when he actually, 4 members of his restaurant were arrested by what I assume is the equivalent of ICE officers today. And they came and arrested 4 members of this restaurant. They said they were illegal, basically, and he posted bond for them, $500 each, and went and testified for them, and they were found to be, citizens. They were actually born in the country, so they were ended up being released. So a little bit about his restaurants. He had a restaurant called the Hong Kong Low. It was at 518 9th Street. And this is a postcard from that showing the front of the restaurant. And then in the planning report, there were 3 other restaurants or eateries that were listed, attributed to his name, but I wasn't aware of them. One at 8th Street Northeast, another at 111 Pennsylvania Avenue, another in Georgetown at 3114 M Street. And then the one I was most familiar with was the Asia Cafe, and or also called the Asian American and Chinese Cafe. It was at 1229 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's actually a card from the restaurant. This is where my father grew up from the age of 8 years old. They lived above this restaurant on the 3rd floor. The restaurant was on the 2nd floor. And that's a picture of the exterior. And that's the inside with my grandfather. The only actual picture we have of him. And this looks like after they did a little remodeling. And that's my grandmother on the right. So this stretch of Pennsylvania Avenue, again, it's 1229 Pennsylvania Avenue. It was, again, on that stretch between the Capitol and the White House. Not only was it kind of a bustling business district, and it had businesses like Central Market, where my father told the stories where he would go with his father. And it was a very large market on Pennsylvania Avenue. I think everybody around that area went there. They would provision the restaurant, for a week. They would get weekly provisions for the restaurant. And again, it was a pretty bustling commercial corridor at the time, but it also had a lot of this symbolic significance and historic significance. And, again, being on that stretch that connects the Capitol and the White House. And some neighbors of my grandparents, 1221 Pennsylvania Avenue had a photo shop called Mystic Photo, and that's a picture of his photo shop. His name was John Leonard, and he would take pictures all around Washington at the time, but he also took pictures right outside the 2nd floor window. He also stayed above his shop, and that's a picture of a parade right on Pennsylvania Avenue. You can see that's the old post office building. That's the Waldorf Astoria now in the background there. But it was also, a host to a Ku Klux Klan rally in 1925. And there were tens of thousands of KKK members that marched right down Chinatown, right through Chinatown, and right in front of my grandparents' restaurant and residence. And my father was only 15 at the time. So it's hard to imagine how that would make Chinese residents of Washington feel seeing this. Of course, they advocated white supremacy through intimidation and violence. But amazing sight, isn't it? So to fill in the map a bit, the Empire Reform Association was right in Chinatown on Pennsylvania Avenue. Central Market, again, was right on Pennsylvania Avenue on the south side, between 7th and 9th Street. Hong Kong Low, 518 9th Street. And when they had that restaurant, they lived right a block down at 439 9th Street. And then the Asia Cafe was right on Pennsylvania Avenue at 1229 Pennsylvania Avenue. Hello. So I'm going to talk about my grandmother now. And she was known as Mamie Bing. Her Chinese name was Wu Ah Choi, also known as Wu Toi. And I did know. I lived with her in Tacoma Park. So, when I was from maybe up to 10 years old, she was almost like a second mother to me. But, and she was, pretty old at that time. She was in her 80s. Then after that, she did have dementia issues. So I didn't really know her as well in that same sense, after maybe I was 10 or 12 until she passed away. I was maybe 16 or 17 years old. But we had stories from family friends about her, and she was also included in some of these articles. So again, just to outline her life in the timeline, she was born in Hong Kong in 1883. She arrived in Vancouver, British Columbia, and then was brought to Philadelphia around 1891 at 8 years of age. And then when she was 13, she was brought to Atlantic City. And at the ages of 14 and 15, she birthed 2 children. Neither survived. And then at the age of 16, she had a child, George, who I knew as Uncle George. He did survive. And then at 20 years old in 1903, she left Atlantic City. And we'll talk more about all of these milestones. And again, we'll talk about her life with Charlie Bay in Washington. And then she died in 1973 at the age of 90. So, whereas my grandfather chose to come to America for opportunity, when my grandmother came as a slave, she was sold by her family when she was 8 years old and brought to Vancouver, British Columbia, to do domestic work. Her owners brought her to Philadelphia. And one of the first things, she didn't talk about it much at all, but she did tell my mother that one of the first things that she did as an 8-year-old slave was to wrap opium in packets for her owner. And she claimed to have no memory of her family, never talked about it, didn't exactly know when her birthday was or even how old she was. So to put this in perspective, it wasn't, uncommon for people to participate in the sale of domestic health, and not just domestic health, but there was also sales for of individuals for other reasons, prostitution, and work in restaurants and things like that. But it was not an uncommon thing at the time. And then when she was 13 years old in Philadelphia, her owners decided to sell her again. She was sold again, this time to a 30-year-old merchant in Atlantic City. And the story she tells about having children at that age is that she was pregnant before she knew what made her pregnant, basically. She didn't know what was happening to her body. So she alleged that she was being abused, and she found her life intolerable in Atlantic City. And even though her son, George, was 4 years old, and she loved him very much, she found it, her situation something that she couldn't live with. So she fled. And, the time that she left Atlantic City to when she showed up in Washington, she never talked about it. Even my mother asked her about it, she wouldn't talk about it. So we don't really know, what she did when she left, but it must have been a very hard time for her. So when she arrived in Washington, this is an excerpt from our article saying that there were only 2 or 3 women in Chinatown. She was one of them. There was a scarcity of Chinese women in Washington, but it wasn't just in Washington. It was really in all the Chinatowns throughout the country. And a lot of it had to do with the Page Act. A lot of it had to do with the fact that the Chinese would come as sojourning laborers, and they'd be mostly male, because that's what those jobs needed, was the male activity, male labor. But when she came to Washington, she became a member of the Church of Ascension, and then later the Calvary Baptist Church. And she was a member of the Calvary Baptist Church for over 40 years, and we'll talk about where that is. So this is an article in the Washington Times in 1907, and it's about the birth of my aunt Mary, who I never met, of course. But it was their first child, and this article said, that he went back to China, found my grandmother there, and brought her back, which we knew wasn't correct. And I think it's really because they didn't want to talk about my grandmother's past. But this particular image I got from the internet, but I had seen that before, because this is the article that she had kept, and she would pull it out, and she would say, this is me, this is your Aunt Mary that you never met, and this is your grandfather. So that it was an important article for her. She kept it all of her life. So to fill in the map a little bit more, the Church of Ascension is still there. It's right on Mass Avenue. And Calvary Baptist is right at 8th and H Street, right in Chinatown, basically. It has a long history working with Chinese community in Washington. And then in 1910, my father was born. Again, there was a big article in paper. It was May 14th. It was when he was born, 1910. But it was obvious in the article that my grandfather was very happy to have a baby boy, and a boy, in particular, versus a girl. But it says that he invited 200 or 300 Chinese friends to this restaurant to celebrate. And my father's Chinese name is Chin Chu Wing, I should say. But they named him as Robert Parsons being, and I'll explain where the Parsons came from. But he changed his name to Chan to keep our family name. And that's what we have as our middle name also, to keep that. So the doctor that was delivered both Mary and my father was Mary Almira Parsons, and this doctor must have impressed my grandparents a lot because they ended up naming both their children after her. But she was the first female doctor below the Mason-Dixon line, and she was known to help the Chinese Washington Chinese community in their medical practice. And as we talked about, Mary died in 1910. And there was an article about that. She was only about 2.5 years old. And the article was basically saying, this is a unique funeral service in that it's a Christian service for a Chinese person. It's the person who brought recollection of Chinatown residents that it was a Christian funeral. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. But that was the press at the time. Dr. Parsons' office is right on H Street. I did want to talk a little bit about George, who, remember, she left in Atlantic City when he was 4 years old. And remember, I said that she loved him very much, and I think he knew that. And as soon as he could, when he was a young adult, he reconnected with my grandmother. He found her in Washington, and kept that relationship going until she died. And that's how I got to know him. He would come down from New York, every year, sleep on her couch, and to visit and to keep that relationship with my grandmother. But he also, when he was 23 years old, 1922, he moved to China, thinking that there were more interesting opportunities for him in China because of the discrimination and so on that Chinese Americans faced here, even though he was a second generation Chinese. And he translated books and literature, and he also worked in the theater there. But one of his most notable works is for the cultural icon Lu Xun. He had the first English translation of the novella that he wrote, The True Story of A.Q. And like I said, he worked in arts and theater. And he also he worked with Mei Lan Fong, which was really a worldwide star at the time, back then. But he was a Chinese opera star. And he also did a US tour that that George worked with him on, and he also wrote a book on Mei Lan Fong. And he was a contributor to the National Geographic, wrote articles on China in the National Geographic. So in 1937, the Japanese invaded China, and he was forced to leave China. And he came back to the US with an endowed lectureship at Yale, which lasted a year. And he ended up lecturing at other universities and having talks in other venues. He never really had the same really interesting career that he had in China when he came back to the US. And he wasn't alone. This is a quote from Charlotte Brooks' book, American Exodus. In the first half of the 20th century, almost half of the Chinese Americans born in the US went back to China because they thought there were more opportunities for them in China. So I think because of just feeling the loss of her daughter, who affected my grandmother very, very much, she was unable to take care of my father after Mary died for a while. Had to have somebody come in and do that for her. But she raised 2 Chinese girls as her own daughters at the time. And then now I want to introduce you to some old family friends. This is Choi and Esther Y. And the Ys, again, knew my family back in the day. And they sat for an interview in 1989 for the oral history of Chinese Americans for the Chinese American Lions Club of Washington. And my mother was a member, and also Dr. Bill Chinley, down here, but he was in that interview also. First, you're going to hear Esther Y, and she has a little bit to say about my grandparents. See if it works.
They had a restaurant, and there's a fun history about that, those two people. But anyway, I was told that.
Tell it to us.
No, I just say that they don't speak to each other for all those years. The latter part of the years, they wouldn't speak to each other, but they lived together as in the same building. They run the he's the cook and she's the restaurant owner or waitress. And but he used to get dressed up. He was so proud. He was very handsome. After his long hair long, I guess so. I don't know what he did also. Yeah, he'd go out in spats and a fur coat and fur hat and with a cane. He's quite a ladies' man. And that's unusual for Chinese. They don't speak that good English if they go out amongst Americans, but he did.
Did you know him personally? I mean, to sit down and talk to him.
Oh, sure, I talked to him all the time, but I knew he was sort of ladies' man.
Yeah, I know, but I just wondered what other kind of person.
Well,
Was he educated per se?
no, he wasn't educated, but he could speak English.
Yeah, he spoke English.
But she had a hard line. And she married this one, but she was determined she wasn't gonna leave anymore. That was enough. So she stuck it out on that thing.
So you could hear that things weren't going great between my grandparents. And in 1932, my grandfather decided to leave. He left my grandmother and my father and left them without any resources. Any wealth he had accumulated, he took back with him to China. So it was a tough time. It was a very tough time for my grandfather and my father. My father had just graduated from Purdue University in civil engineering, but it was during the Great Depression. So it was hard for him to find a job. And of course, my grandmother didn't have any resources or way to make a living. But they eventually found a place to live. My father eventually did find a job with the federal government. He started as a draftsman and then eventually a civil engineer. But they eventually found a place to live at 604 H Street. It's known as the Mary Surratt boarding house in the new Chinatown location. And this is a picture of it, probably earlier than when they were there. But I don't know if you're familiar with it. This is how it looks now. And it's if you're not familiar with the history of that building, and I know you have a story about it too in your family, but Mary Surratt owned that building as a boarding house in 1865, and she was convicted of being one of the conspirators, John Wilkes Booth, for plotting the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and she was convicted and hanged for that. But that was the building that they all met in. And that's the plaque that's out front. So again, Chinatown at the time had moved to where it is now, right on, centered on H Street, between like 5th and 9th. And they were staying again right in the middle of it, 604 H Street. So, a little over a decade later, my father met my mother. They fell in love, wanted to get married. And they knew, though, that they couldn't marry in Whitfield, where she was from, because even though there had been legislation before preventing interracial marriage, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 for the first time made it a felony for Asians to marry whites in Virginia. So that was in effect in 1946 when they wanted to get married. And wasn't repealed until 1967 in Loving v. Virginia, if you're familiar with that. So they got married at the Chinese Community Church. This is when it was at 1011 L Street. It's not there anymore. I know it's right down here. But it had moved from Mount Pleasant Methodist Church where it began. And Troy Y actually was on the committee to relocate the church at the time. So again, I have a little clip of him saying,
trying to find a site, a place for the Chinese church to move to
Oh, that's
from Mount
interesting.
Vernon. Finally,
so again, to fill in the map a bit, the Chinese Community Church at the time was at 1011 L Street. So, this is the area where my ancestors spent a lot of time, dating all the way back to the late 19th century. And I thought I'd leave you today with just some pictures from back then. And, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to field the questions.
Yeah. I have a question.
Mhm.
What was it like growing up in the DMV area being a mixed kid with a mixed family? My mom is white and my dad's Asian or Chinese. And I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and sometimes my dad would be like, yeah, people are staring at us, but I never noticed that. So I was wondering if you felt like there was any kind of people like looking at you from either the Chinese community or the white community being like, why are they together?
Right. Well, it's funny, and I write about this in my book. I wouldn't have time to cover everything in the book, obviously, but it's funny that people don't really relate to me as Chinese, and they don't really relate to me as white. So I'm that no man's zone. I'm that kind of that other. A lot of times people will come up to me and speak Spanish, and they speak they think I'm Hispanic. So it's kind of confusing, to be in that situation. It's a little bit of a social awkwardness to not being in one group or the other, and people not really knowing what group you are in, and then mistaking you for a different group. So it was very confusing in that sense. Now, my father and I think my grandparents, and again, I don't know my grandfather that well, but I know my grandmother didn't teach my father any Chinese. And she wanted him to be an American more than anything. So he didn't, it's funny because he didn't ever speak Chinese. Therefore, I never learned Chinese. He wasn't really that connected with the Chinese community either. We would come to Chinatown and have dim sum, but that was pretty much the extent of it. But I guess to answer your question, there was a lot of just misunderstandings, I guess, about what my ethnicity is, and I can tell people sometimes trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Currently in pop culture, being like mixed is Asian specifically. It's
Yeah,
like
we were listening to that
huge.
on there was a program on the radio about that.
I actually just got a text from my friends last night that was like, we need to create the Wasian picture from Leve. She had a music video with like only Wasian people in it. And it's been really interesting as like now that that identity is so popular, I guess. Cause
Mhm.
like even when I was growing up, it was kind of, I felt very similarly. It's like I'm not Chinese enough to be Chinese. And then also
Right.
white people don't view you as white either.
Exactly, yeah.
It's such a, I don't know, interesting thing to watch.
It is, it really is. And, I looked at some of the videos and some of the interviews that were on the 1882 website. And there were folks that had grown up in Chinatown. A lot of people on the interviews, that grew up in Chinatown. I was kind of envious of them because they had that Chinese group that they always were shown with. And they had all that commonality and that, that bond between them that, I couldn't claim, I just couldn't claim.
Yeah. Elaine on the Zoom asked, she mentioned, I heard the Chinatown moved from Pennsylvania to where it is now because the powers that be didn't want the president to walk through Chinatown during inauguration. Have you heard of that?
I have not heard of that. I haven't heard of that. What I have heard is that, there were federal projects that made them move. They wanted to build, big federal projects, and because of that, they were dislocated or located to an area. But I haven't heard. Could be. I don't know.
Do you feel like your family history something that your dad talked about a lot, or was it
Yeah.
something that like your mom
My mom.
extracted information from him?
Yeah.
And talked about?
My father didn't really talk about things that were things like that about family history or things that were deeply important to him. He didn't bring them out. It's just the way he revealed himself to others. He talked about day-to-day things. Don't leave the lights on, get your car fixed or something like that. But he didn't talk about family in that sense. But my mother, was she just interested in her family? She was interested in his family and his history. And in particular, she was interested that we knew it. So she would be the conduit for knowing all that.
I knew your mom did into the family history
Mhm.
stuff. How extensive did the set of oral histories go? I mean, you played a couple of excerpts. Did she do a lot of that?
She didn't. But I almost could say that she was more Chinese than my father in that sense because she was a part of the Chinese American Lions Club, and that's who had those interviews. Actually, it was a neighbor of ours who orchestrated that. He was a Cheyenne member also, but she didn't do a lot of that. What she would do is she would write it down, and that's how she would convey the information to us, and tell us stories. Every time we were with her, it'd be one story or reiteration of a story she'd already told. So to us, yes, there's an oral history, but as formal interviews like that, not really.
Elaine has another question.
Mhm.
Were the Chinese tongs bootleggers during Prohibition like the mafia was?
Not that I know of, but it's funny you mentioned bootleggers. I mean, this is my friend Danny over here who had a funny history about 604 H Street, where his family actually bootlegged in that building.
Yeah.
But they weren't Chinese. They were, you want to fill in?
So in 1928, that Surratt House, featured in a newspaper story that ran coast to coast. Because my grandmother's brothers, who were great bootleggers, were using that as a bottling facility, and the revenuers raided the building. All grandmother's brothers, godfather, all. But it was, bootlegging in Washington was not like the kinds of stuff that you see on TV in Chicago. It wasn't a violence fueled kind of thing. There weren't battles over territory. There were no great big gangs. It was a rather peaceful.
Peaceful bootlegging
Process.
operation.
Well, in part because of the crass hypocrisy of Congress. While Congress had voted the Volstead Act, most members of Congress still drank. And so they needed somebody to supply liquor. And when we talk about the bootleggers, they were largely bringing in whiskey from Canada or from the British Isles. It wasn't a bunch of guys running a still someplace.
Yeah, my mother did say that my grandfather used to make rice wine back in the day because he couldn't get it elsewhere. That and the noodles that he served, he would make, but not bootlegging. I hadn't heard that.
I guess my last question is, do you feel like the Chinese proverb that your mother wrote down,
Mhm.
do you feel connected to that after doing all this research?
I do, very much so. And that's why I wrote that book. I mean, really for no other reasons. There were, my mother would tell these stories to us all the time, and they were floating in the air, and they were in thousands of documents here and there. But I was afraid. I'm the kind of person that wants things neatly in place. So I wanted to put them in a very in an accessible way for other people, not just our family, because I think the lessons in it are good lessons for, more than our family, for the community and the country in general. But the answer is yes. The more I did it, I felt even more that way. But it was an inspiration to do it. Yeah.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about anything surrounding dynamics, whether it's from your family's history, your own experience in DC, or other communities in DC.
So with other communities? Well, unfortunately, I didn't have the, you mean it from the Chinese perspective or?
I think your personal experience, Chinese perspective, like any sort of dimension there.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't have the firsthand experience, like I was saying, of living in Chinatown. So, I don't have that firsthand knowledge of how Chinatown related. You mean how Chinatown related with other
I think just like
communities?
being Chinese in DC, whether it's Chinatown or not, just with all the other populations that are in and around DC, and how that's a shifted over the years.
I think it's basically shifted out of DC,
Yeah, of course.
gone to the suburbs. But we weren't, part of a huge Chinese community, although we had a lot of, older Chinese friends. So that's how we kept the connection, basically. Oh,
Yeah, I
did
think
that answer the question?
you need to remember that Washington, the metropolitan area was much smaller back when we were growing up than it is now. And the Chinese population was actually quite small. Where we grew up in the Tacoma Park area, I think I could probably name all the Chinese kids that I was in school with because they were that few.
Yeah, and same with me.
I'm just curious, like, what DC being Chocolate City, all the other kinds of communities are here as well, like, how you showed up among the broader, like, DC, like, population, and whether that has been personal experience, whether it's like family and like how your father and grandfather experienced that being here. So like expanding beyond just the Chinese community, but like in broader DC itself.
Well, like Danny was saying, I think my exposure to the Chinese was pretty limited, other than family friends. And when I was growing up in school, there would be maybe one or two, other Chinese people in the grades with me. So I didn't have a lot of I don't have a lot of knowledge of how the Chinese community, work with the broader Washington community.
What school did you grow up going to?
I went to Northwestern High School and Rolling Crest Junior High School,
What was like the demographic of your friends there?
mostly white, almost all white. And one of my best friends was African American back then, which I talk about in the book too.
Well, thank you, Richard.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a real pleasure.
For anyone who wants to buy his book, to be found on Amazon, do you have anything?
Yeah, I do have some copies back here. If you want to purchase it, I'd be happy to sell it to you.
This concludes our talk story presentation. If you would like to learn more, this will be posted on YouTube, and you can find Richard's book on Amazon. And if you want to connect with him personally, you can contact 1882 Foundation at info@1882foundation.org on Gmail. Thank you.
Yeah.